Renewables, to him and the rest of the fossil fuel industry, are a threat. But Secretary Wright says that we can't know when the sun shines, so let's check just to be sure. Operators, scale back the legacy resources! On July 4th, 2025, Donald Trump signed his so-called Big Beautiful Bill into law. This bill, of course, has a lot of things in it. I think the version that I downloaded from GovTrack has 870 pages on it. And so that makes it hard to really understand the impacts we might see from it all. To help with this, I want to cover a small part of the bill, but a part that I believe is rather consequential, and that's its rollbacks on renewable energy credits. Now, instead of just going through pages and pages of legislation, I thought it might be fun to look at how Trump's insiders are covering the energy provisions of this bill. Lucky for us, our very own Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, recently published an opinion piece defending this bill in the New York Post. Now, Chris Wright is rather interesting to me, in part due to some of our striking similarities. He's a self-described energy nerd. I'm a self-described energy nerd. He's apparently worked in the past on renewables. I currently work on renewables. But that's about where the similarities stop. He's the founder of a multi-billion-dollar fossil fuel company, Liberty Energy, and was CEO of that company, making apparently more than $5 million a year before he became our energy secretary. No conflict of interest concerns there. Now, as you might expect, this administration's approach to renewables is, shall we say, far from nuanced. It's shockingly simplistic. Secretary Wright's article made that abundantly clear. Let's take a look, shall we? How the Big Beautiful Bill Will Lower Energy Costs, Shore Up the Electric Grid, and Unleash American Prosperity by Chris Wright. Published on June 27th, 2025, so just about a week before the bill was signed into law. How much would you pay for an Uber if you didn't know when it would pick you up or where it was going to drop you off? Probably not much. That's true. I wouldn't pay that much for an Uber that doesn't do the two things I need from it, namely picking me up and dropping me off. Not sure what this has to do with the electric grid yet, but let's continue. Yet this is the same effect that variable generation sources like wind and solar have on our power grids. Okay, I see now. He's setting up a nice straw man, gotta give him credit. You never know if these energy sources will actually be able to produce electricity when you need it, because you don't know if the sun will be shining or the wind blowing. Even so, the federal government has subsidized these sources for decades, resulting in higher electricity prices and a less stable grid. Okay, I feel like now we've gotten to the meat of his argument. Basically, renewables rely on sources that we can't possibly predict, and so they are bad. And I really wish this wasn't the case, but this is essentially his entire argument throughout the article. So I'm going to walk us through why this is very silly, and it will be worth it because if you agree that this argument doesn't make much sense, then there really isn't much left to refute in the rest of the piece. So let's start with the first line. You never know if these energy sources will actually be able to produce electricity when you need it, because you don't know if the sun will be shining or the wind blowing. Except we know very accurately when the sun shines, and that's between sunrise and sunset of every single day. And you know what else? We know very precisely the exact sunrise and sunset times for every single day, down to, the second at least, all over the world for as long into the future as humans will ever be around for. Now, I know this isn't truly his argument. I'm sure Secretary Wright is familiar with the movement of the sun. He's referring to cloud cover blocking the sun, which is a more reasonable concern. Why don't we take a look together at how chaotic and unpredictable the grid must be when there's a ton of renewables like solar and wind on the grid? California has a lot of renewables, right? Yeah, their grid must be a mess. Let's search California grid current conditions. Okay, let's see what we got going on here. Grid status normal, that's a good sign. Let's see, let's scroll down a little bit, see what we're looking at. Let's see, demand trend. System demand in megawatts compared to the forecasted demand in 5-minute increments. Okay, so what this is showing is in the dashed line, the forecasted demand, so how much demand there is for electricity on the California grid, so for millions of people, in 5-minute increments throughout the day. And as we can see, the dark green is the actual realized demand on the grid throughout the day. And by the looks of it, the actual demand has essentially fallen exactly on top of the forecast for the entire day. And that seems crazy because demand, I would think, could be super chaotic. How do they know when I'm going to use my coffee grinder? Well, I guess I use it in the morning, basically every morning. But still, they can't know when my AC turns on, unless they're also looking at weather forecasts. I guess they've gotten pretty good at guessing exactly how much electricity Californians are using at all times of the day. That's pretty neat. But that doesn't tell us about renewables. Let's keep scrolling. Let's see, net demand trend. System demand minus wind and solar. Perfect. In 5-minute increments compared to total system and forecasted demand. Okay, so now we're looking at a few things. Net demand is what they call all the demand on the grid. So everyone's lights, EVs, ACs, all of it, minus the wind and solar being produced at that time. So basically, net load is what the system operators need to be able to supply to the grid with everything that isn't wind or solar. And let's see, just like the demand graph we looked at earlier, this one shows the net demand over the course of the day, along with the projected net load. So now we are seeing how well the operators can project solar and wind generation, since net load is demand minus solar and wind. So they must be guessing how much solar and wind there would be to get the net load forecast. And would you look at that, the actual net load is exactly on top of the forecasted values, the dashed values, for the entire day. This doesn't make sense. The Energy Secretary said you don't know if the sun will be shining or the wind blowing. But apparently, California grid operators do know when the sun shines and when the wind blows, because they can forecast a net load a whole day early. Let's keep scrolling. Let's see. You guys. 7-day resource adequacy capacity trend. You guys, I thought Kaizo was just forecasting a day at a time. This is a 7-day forecast showing the net load at every hour of every day for the next week. And look at how good the forecast has been for today. How could they possibly know when the sun shines and when the wind blows and when everyone will use their coffee grinders and everything else all week? Okay, new theory. California's grid is black magic. I don't get it, but there's no way that other states can also pull this off. What's another state with renewables but that wouldn't have access to California's sorcery? Texas. Yeah, they have a good amount of solar and wind in Texas. Let's check Texas. Texas grid conditions. Grid conditions, Electric Reliability Council at Texas. Okay. Let's see. Grid and market conditions. Scrolling. Okay. Combined wind and solar. Okay, so here they're just showing straight up actual wind and solar forecasts and generation. The forecasts are dotted, the generation is solid, wind is in blue, solar is in orange, but none of the net load things. This is just straight up how much wind and solar electricity is being generated in Texas. And looking at this, again, the forecast looks pretty good. It looks like wind today had like a little bit of time where there was more electricity than they were expecting, but solar is like smack on, like very, very accurate. Oh, and look, we currently have current day selected. I can click on next day and boom, there's the forecasts for tomorrow. So Texas also seems to conflict with Secretary Wright's claim. It looks like they do know when the sun will shine and when the wind will blow today and tomorrow. And I would bet that they even have longer forecasts too that I'm just not finding right now. Now, hopefully you all can tell that I'm being a bit facetious here. I work on renewables and I'm familiar with solar and wind forecasts. I just wanted to highlight that your Secretary of Energy really said you never know if these energy sources, solar and wind, will actually be able to produce electricity when you need it because you don't know if the sun will be shining or the wind blowing. And this is, at the very least, extremely misleading because California and Texas and the rest of the country too, are very, very skilled at knowing the generation coming from renewables several days ahead of time. Now his next statement. Even so, the federal government has subsidized these sources for decades, resulting in higher electricity prices and a less stable grid. This line makes me very upset, because many Americans are both paying more for electricity than they used to, and are experiencing more frequent and longer power outages. And while, as you can imagine, these are nuanced issues, our Secretary of Energy here wants us to believe that the cause of this is federal subsidies for renewables. I'll go over some of the details in a moment, but I want to be super clear here that my perspective is the exact inverse of the Secretary's. The US government has invested in renewables because we had reason to believe that electricity might get more expensive and outages more frequent in the future, and renewables could help us deal with those problems. And that prediction was right. More frequent and more intense storms and wildfires caused more power outages, which has contributed to higher prices in parts of the country. Now, analysis on this is somewhat difficult, but it might be the case that renewables have actually helped us rather than hurt us on this front. Adding distributed generation sources and energy storage means that communities can have access to electricity even when transmission lines get knocked over in a hurricane, or they can at least have their power restored faster than if they had had to wait for the whole bulk power system to come back online. But you don't have to take my word for it. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC for short, just recently published their 2025 State of Reliability Report. Their key takeaways were that severe weather was responsible for the most severe outages in 2024, that generator performance is actually improving during winter storms, And the battery energy storage systems can actually improve primary frequency response, aiding in grid stability and reliability. Now, I could make a whole video just on this topic, but for brevity, let's remember why the Secretary is publishing this opinion piece in the first place: to defend the bill that his boss just signed into law. So why would the Secretary spend his time trying to convince you that renewable subsidies specifically have made the grid worse? Because the reconciliation bill strips a lot of renewable subsidies. Specifically, it rolls back the so-called investment tax credits and production tax credits, or ITC and PTC for short, that were funded by the Inflation Reduction Act for renewable energy projects. Those credits have helped fund the construction of solar and wind all over the country for the last few years, mostly in places that skew Republican, actually. This actually helps explain why some Republicans in Congress insisted on softening the damage, allowing the credits to go on for projects that begin construction before June of 2027. Now, this is still a huge detriment to the energy sector, but you have to ask yourself, if the Secretary is right that renewable subsidies make electricity more expensive and less stable, then why would any Republican in Congress be wary of canceling those subsidies? Let's continue reading. President Donald Trump knows what to do: eliminate green tax credits from the Democrats' so-called Inflation Reduction Act, including those for wind and solar power. Right, we figured out that this was what he was defending already, but at least now it's crystal clear. The One Big Beautiful Bill seeks to do that, along with other proposals like canceling billions in Biden's Green New Deal money and making much-needed investments in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Interesting. It aims to set an aggressive end date for these subsidies and build on the president's push for affordable, abundant, and secure energy for the nation. We just talked about the aggressive end date for the subsidies, and remember that a few Republicans in Congress insisted on making the bill less aggressive because they've seen the value of renewable projects in their own districts. But let's continue. The House bill begins phasing out these tax credits within 3 years, saving hundreds of billions for American taxpayers. Now, this video isn't about the reconciliation bill in its entirety, but I should note, of course, that the bill as a whole adds to our nation's deficit quite dramatically, despite the tone of the Secretary here. Wind and solar subsidies have been particularly wasteful and counterproductive. All right, here we go. One example, the Renewable Electric Production Tax Credit, PTC if you recall, was first introduced in 1992, when wind energy was a nascent industry. This tax credit, originally set to phase out in 1999, was sold on a promise of low-cost energy with fewer trade-offs. Since 1999, the REPTC, that PTC tax credit, has been extended a whopping 12 times, yet consumers continue to pay more on average for their home electric bills than in 1992, even after adjusting for inflation. This doesn't sound quite right to me. Something's definitely off here. Consumers continue to pay more on average for their home electric bills than in 1992, even after adjusting for inflation. Notice the subtlety here. Pay more on average for their home electric bills. Let's think through that. Why might your home electric bill go up? Really, there are two primary reasons that I can think of. Either the utility has charged you a higher rate, so more per kilowatt hour of electricity, or you used more electricity. So let's check on both. Note that I'll be comparing to 2023 for data availability reasons. Now, the EIA, or the Energy Information Administration, publishes an annual energy review each year, and I was able to find the review for 1992. And according to the EIA's report, if I scroll down here a bit, here it is. This report says that the average real price of electricity sold to the residential sector was 6.8 cents per kilowatt hour. And just a note that this is expressed in 1987 dollars, but it's the price from 1992. Now, a quick check of inflation rates shows that the cumulative rate of inflation between 1987 and 2023 was 168.2%. So that 6.8 cents from 1992 is equivalent to about 18.2 cents in 2023. Now, if we fast forward to 2023, EIA reports an average retail electricity price of 16 cents per kilowatt hour in 2023. So adjusted for inflation, it looks like electricity rates actually fell by about 2 cents per kilowatt hour between 1992 and 2023. Now, a note that average electricity rates aren't super meaningful anyway, because how much you're paying for your electricity depends a lot on where in the US you live, as you can see by this map. We'll come back to this, don't worry. But for the purpose of checking the Secretary's claim, it seems that average residential rates are very close to, if not lower than what they were in 1992. Okay, so that's rates. Now let's check the other reason that bills might have increased, because people have increased their electricity usage. Lucky for us, the EIA has another incredible report, Drivers of US Household Energy Consumption, 1980 to 2009. Now, I know this isn't exactly what we're looking for, but I promise the point will be very clear. Scrolling down, we can see that the report highlights that household electricity usage increased dramatically in the 1990s. Households increased their electricity usage by 24.9% between 1990 and 2001, and then an additional 12.1% between 2001 and 2009. I would say a reasonable approximation from this data would be that households use at least 50% more electricity today than they did in 1992. So while the Secretary wants us to believe that we pay more for electricity today because of renewable subsidies, I hope it's clear that the overwhelming reason we pay more for electricity is because we use way more of it. He also specifically targeted the Renewable Energy Production Tax Credit, so let's quickly touch on that as well. Here I'm going to look at the Congressional Research Service's Renewable Electricity Production Tax Credit brief from 2020. And if we scroll down, we can find this table that shows the PTC estimated tax expenditures from 2005 up to 2023. Keep in mind, this report was published in 2020, so the numbers aren't going to be perfect. But according to this report, the production tax credit accounted for about $59 billion of tax expenditures between 2005 and 2023, if we just add up all of these renewable resource numbers. Now keep in mind that this was over a 19-year time period, and that the current reconciliation bill that the Secretary is defending is expected to lead to trillions of dollars of cost over the next 10 years. But we can put that aside for now. $59 billion over 10 years, that's certainly not nothing, so what did we accomplish with that? Here I'm looking at the levelized cost of energy, or LCOE. As you can see, we brought down the cost of wind power by about a factor of 3, and the cost of solar power by about a factor of 10 between 2009 and 2024. Here, let me zoom in so we can see this a bit better. As you can see, solar is in this kind of yellow color. In 2009, it cost about $360 per megawatt hour to produce energy with utility scale solar. And in 2024, it cost more like $40 to $60. And the story is the same with wind. It did cost about $135 in 2009, and today it costs seemingly about $50. Oh, and to be clear, these costs are not including subsidies. This is just like, if you buy all the equipment and all the land you need and build a wind or solar power plant, and then you add up all the costs, how much does it cost per unit of energy that you end up generating? This is it. What subsidies do is help bring these numbers lower to help make renewable projects economical across the country so that they can benefit more Americans. So to me, that feels impressive and not wasteful or counterproductive. Now, I can hear you already, but Spencer, who cares if the tech is cheaper? I mean, that's cool, but you already said that our electricity didn't get cheaper. Well, it did, but not a whole lot. So what gives? Well, first off, thank you for the question. May I remind you of this map that I promised you to get back to, which is showing inflation-adjusted electricity prices by state between 2013 and 2023. The blue coloring signifies states where the electricity prices actually got cheaper, adjusted for inflation, and then the kind of yellow-brown states are where it got more expensive. Notice how a ton of states are blue? Specifically, it looks like several states in the Midwest are actually pretty dark blue. A good number of these blue states brought a lot of wind power online during this decade. Again, averages can only be so helpful. For a lot of Americans, the massive reduction in the cost of wind and solar did help lower their electricity prices. Beyond just helping electricity rates, renewables are like really major now. This table here is showing historical electricity generation by source information. And if I move myself out of the way so that you can see, wind accounted for less than half of 1% of electricity generation in the US, and solar was essentially zero. Fast forward to 2023, wind was 10.2% and solar 3.9%. That's like factor of 20 growth for wind and like factor of 100 or more growth for solar. And this still isn't even the full story because this is 2023. Let me show you something. This is one of my favorite reports of the year. This is by Ember Energy, and yes, I did check the numbers myself and these are accurate. In March 2025, fossil fuels accounted for less than 50% of electricity generated for the first month on record. And that was driven primarily by an increase in wind and solar power, which had reached a record 24.4% of US electricity in March of 2025. I manually checked for April as well, and it turns out this is still true in April. So for at least 2 months, fossil fuels made up less than half of our electricity generation. Think about that. Averaging over all of March and April this year, solar and wind were a quarter of our electricity generation, and fossil fuels were less than half. The grid is changing. I strongly believe it's for the better, and the subsidies that Secretary Wright keeps complaining about played a critical role in enabling this. Okay, back to the article. I got sidetracked. Plus, today, more than 75% of US electricity comes from natural gas, nuclear, interesting, and coal. Natural gas, nuclear, and coal, okay. And they supply it 24/7, independent of the weather. Okay, this line is extremely revealing if it's not clear. Natural gas, nuclear, and coal. One of these is not like the others. But remember what we just looked at together. Natural gas and coal made up less than half of our grid in March and April of this year. It wouldn't sound nearly as impressive if the secretary had to say, fossil fuels provided less than half of our nation's electricity for the first month ever this March, and did so again in April. The gradual fall of fossil fuels has forced people, like the secretary, to bring other technologies to the in-group. Now, I could honestly make an entire video about the rise of pro-nuclear sentiments in the US. Let me know if you don't want to watch that, by the way. But in short, I'm of the opinion that a major reason people like Secretary Wright are okay letting nuclear into their in-club is because they know that nuclear is not going to be what topples their fossil fuel empire. For a whole myriad of reasons, nuclear hasn't significantly replaced fossil fuels since its invention over 60 years ago. And I believe that Chris Wright believes that that will still be true 60 years in the future. However, I don't think he feels that way about renewables. Renewables, to him and the rest of the fossil fuel industry, are a threat. Now, on his point about how they supply it 24/7 independent of the weather, this is him describing so-called baseload generation, which is the category that many are using to justify the combining of fossil fuels with nuclear. His point is literally true, that natural gas, coal, and nuclear are typically used as baseload generators that provide fairly constant power output at all times. But he's clearly trying to imply that this is a benefit, that across the board, baseload generation is somehow better than variable generation sources like solar or wind. Never mind that hydropower is also a baseload generation source, but conveniently Secretary Wright doesn't want to highlight hydro in his natural gas, nuclear, coal list. Interesting. If we go back to the California ISO, we can see that currently renewables are making up more than 3/4 of their supply. This is just a snapshot of right now, but I checked the numbers, and CAISO is operating with about 43% of its generation on average coming from coal, natural gas, and nuclear. In the Southwest power pool, the number is 58%, and even in Texas, it's 65%. Clearly, grids are more than capable of operating fine at numbers well below Wright's 75%. Climate change activists are predictably up in arms over efforts to end the subsidies. But like Uber rides, energy generation is pointless if it flunks the test of reliable delivery. We've already addressed the weird Uber analogy, so I'm just going to continue for now. At 8 p.m. on Inauguration Day, okay guys, this is my favorite part of the whole article. Get ready, this is fun. Okay, at 8 p.m. on Inauguration Day, amid bitter cold across much of the eastern seaboard, we reached peak demand for electricity in the Mid-Atlantic region. Okay. At that point in time, PJM Interconnection, which supplies the Mid-Atlantic United States, they're the same as the California ISO thing, but on the East Coast, got approximately 44% of its power from coal, 24% from natural gas, 25% from nuclear, 3% from oil, 3% from wind, 1% from hydro, and 0% from solar. He goes on, think about that. When Americans most needed dependable power to heat their homes and businesses to stay alive, solar and wind were non-factors. Our homes, hospitals, and businesses only continued to operate because there was enough reliable baseload energy from natural gas, coal, and nuclear available to meet demand. How valuable is a teammate who occasionally shows up for practice but is never there at game time? Wow, standing ovation for me on this one, Chris. That's honestly an impressive level of sass and confidence, but an even more impressively lazy cherry-picked data point. Did you catch it? Let's revisit. At 8 p.m. on Inauguration Day, okay, Inauguration Day was January 20th, remember? We reached peak demand for electricity in the Mid-Atlantic region. All right, let's take Washington, D.C. as an example location to fully immerse ourselves here in this argument. So it's 8 p.m. on January 20th in Washington, D.C. I'm pretty sure the sun is set at this point, but Secretary Wright says that we can't know when the sun shines, so let's check just to be sure. Sunset time, January 20th, 2025, Washington, D.C. Sunrise and sunset times in DC. Scrolling, January 20th. Okay, y'all, the sun set at 5:16 p.m. on January 20th. So in the example, I'm in DC, it's 8 p.m., the sun set about 3 hours ago, so I would say it's comfortably nighttime. And the secretary's gotcha here is that solar isn't powering my home right now. Just for the sake of it, let's check. At this exact same moment, what was happening on the other side of the country? Well, at CAISO, solar and wind were still generating about 21.4% of the load. Earlier that day, that number was 73%, almost 3/4 of the load. So while Secretary Wright was busy shaking his fist in DC at the already set sun for not powering his heater, West Coasters had just enjoyed a day getting nearly 3/4 of their power at the peak from solar and wind, mind you, in mid-January. And the more we load our grid with intermittent generation, the worse the grid performs during times of maximum stress and demand. Of course, for these big statements, he doesn't have any source or data to support his claims, but just remember that we already saw that extreme weather events are the dominant contributor to increased outages over the last decade or so, and that renewables and storage on the grid are actually helping to address this problem. Subsidies are meant to drive prices down and boost supply, but subsidizing wind and solar has done exactly the opposite. Again, we saw together that retail electricity rates are lower today than they were in 1992. We just use a lot more electricity than we used to. Supply has increased. And if I pull up this other EIA article, solar and battery storage make up 81% of new US electric generating capacity in 2024. So essentially, if we take Secretary Wright at his word that subsidies were meant to drive prices down and boost supply, then they've been successful in doing so. These sources force grid operators to maintain two separate systems, one for legacy power and another for renewable sources. When wind and solar come online, legacy resources must be scaled back. Okay, the point here is true, although he makes it sound like solar and wind are these like rare commodities with his when wind and solar come online. Oh wow, the sun is shining today. Brothers, sisters, everybody rejoice. And is that a breeze I feel coming on as well? We are blessed. Operators, scale back the legacy resources. All right, sorry, jokes aside, yes, when there is high solar and wind generation, we get to stop burning natural gas and coal, which, let me remind you, are fuels that cost money. So wind and solar let us stop burning money. Plus there's the whole air pollution thing too, but it's difficult to store electricity from wind and solar. So when wind and solar aren't available at times of peak demand, reliable baseload sources must scale up. Bottom line, higher costs. So I don't want to neglect this argument because I do think it's important for everyone to understand and think about it for themselves. Basically, his point is this. Sure, renewables can be great when they generate in high quantities, but sometimes we're bound to be unlucky and there will be a stretch of time with little or no renewable energy generation. So we're going to need enough generation capacity from dispatchable sources, he's thinking like natural gas and coal, to be able to fully cover our max demand in case renewables can't provide it in those moments. And so, the thinking goes, we sort of have to have two separate systems, as he says, with enough infrastructure to generate from baseload generators, and then all this extra infrastructure for renewables. And he argues that this is an inefficiency that drives up costs. But critically, this ignores several key points. First, we have renewable baseload generation. Hydropower is dispatchable. Geothermal, although still a relatively small part of our grid, is dispatchable. Nuclear, not renewable, but still, is sort of dispatchable. Operators of nuclear power plants don't love ramping it up and down all the time, as you can maybe imagine, but it is possible. So it's not the case that only fossil fuels can act as the baseload capacity. Second, we can store excess energy generated by renewables when they make more energy than we need. Secretary Wright shrugs this point off with his line that it's difficult to store electricity from wind and solar, by which he means that batteries are expensive, but their prices have fallen dramatically and continue to do so thanks to global investments in the technologies, mostly from China, and we're already starting to see pretty rapid deployment of storage on the grid. I should probably make a whole video on grid scale storage, but for now, the key takeaway is that we absolutely can, and in fact already do, store excess electricity generated by solar and wind for use when their generation decreases. Okay, third point, and I cannot stress this one enough, solar and wind have no fuel costs. It is literally free generated electricity, so the grid is saving money from wind and solar by not burning other fuels. Also, the fact that households have started adding serious generation at the distribution level has avoided additional infrastructure upgrades for transmission lines and things like that that would have been required if we had had to build more fossil fuel plants instead. So for at least 3 reasons, we have and can expand renewable baseload generation, we can store excess electricity from variable resources, and we save fuel and infrastructure costs by using variable resources. It is absolutely not the bottom line that solar and wind lead to higher costs. Indeed, wind and solar subsidies not only cost taxpayers, but also force providers to add more dispatchable resources to the grid at their expense. These costs are then passed on to ratepayers. This argument is similar to the one that we just addressed in detail, So just recall that there are savings passed on to ratepayers as well, and that average retail electricity rates are not higher today than they were when Congress first created the production tax credit for renewables. In other words, more wind and solar brings us the worst of two worlds: less reliable energy delivery and higher electric bills. Again, he frustratingly has his cause and effect very confused. Extreme weather events challenge grid reliability by causing mass power outages, and that leads to higher electricity bills to cover the infrastructure repairs and upgrades needed. Solar, wind, and storage are our best bets to address these risks and help keep our grid reliable and affordable. It's time to stop subsidizing such insanity in perpetuity. If sources are truly economically viable, let's allow them to stand on their own and stop forcing Americans to pick up the tab if they're not. Since day one, President Trump has been focused on lowering costs and promoting affordable, reliable, and secure energy sources. The One Big Beautiful Bill brings us one step closer to cementing this legacy and unleashing economic prosperity for the American people. Well, we made it to the end. Congratulations if you're still with me. That was a struggle. Now, clearly, Secretary Wright isn't providing a comprehensive argument here. I'm not even sure that he was trying to. And honestly, that's my biggest concern. Am I deeply bothered by the attacks on renewables and stripping of subsidies that have helped create jobs, spread the benefits of renewables to more Americans, decreased our emissions, and helped create a grid that will be more resilient in the face of worsening storms and fires? Yeah, that sucks. But I get the impression that our energy secretary, who was tasked with supporting our nation's energy infrastructure that provides everything from comfort to essential services to all Americans, didn't go into this position intending to serve Americans. He intended to serve Donald Trump. And that's all this article really is. A string of semi-coherent arguments and unsupported claims that I'm quite confident were written to please Trump. But let me know what you think. Are you concerned about our electrical grid? Do you have questions, suggestions, or even corrections for me? Leave a comment below. And if you want to see more content like this, go ahead and subscribe.